At the very edge of the known world, where the Arctic Ocean locks itself into a shifting prison of ice and the sun vanishes for months at a time, there once existed a region that explorers believed held more than just snow and silence. In the early 1900s, the Arctic was not simply a destination. It was a fixation that pulled in governments, scientists, and powerful financiers who were willing to risk lives and fortunes to uncover what lay beyond the last mapped horizon. Among these frozen lands, Franz Josef Land stood as one of the most remote and least understood archipelagos on Earth, a place where massive glaciers covered volcanic rock, and where the landscape itself seemed to suggest that something older and more complex was hidden beneath its surface. Expeditions that reached these islands often returned with fragmented accounts, describing unusual geological formations, unexpected discoveries, and conditions that challenged everything they thought they knew about the region. Over time, the involvement of wealthy patrons, including figures connected to the Rothschild financial network, added another layer to the story, raising questions about why such dangerous missions were being funded and whether all of their findings were ever made public. The truth, as it turns out, is not rooted in fantasy, but in a series of real events that unfolded between 1903 and 1905, when a stranded expedition was forced to explore the Arctic in ways it had never intended. What they discovered during that time would quietly reshape scientific understanding, even as parts of their story faded into obscurity. The Arctic obsession at the turn of the century, the late 19th century, marked a turning point in humanity's relationship with the Arctic, as advancements in navigation, shipbuilding, and scientific instrumentation made it possible to venture further into the polar regions than ever before, transforming what had once been an unreachable expanse into a target of intense exploration. The discovery of Franz Josef Land during the Austro-Hungarian North Pole expedition between 1872 and 1874 introduced a vast and fragmented archipelago that immediately captured the attention of explorers and scientists alike, not only because of its location, but because of its unusual geological characteristics. Unlike the relatively uniform ice fields that many had expected, these islands were composed of steep basalt cliffs, layered rock formations, and extensive glacial systems that hinted at a violent and dynamic past shaped by volcanic activity and shifting climates over millions of years. Early accounts described landscapes that felt almost alien, with towering formations rising abruptly from the ice and sections of exposed rock that suggested processes still not fully understood at the time. This complexity made Franz Josef Land particularly valuable to scientists who were beginning to explore the idea that the Earth's climate had undergone dramatic changes, as evidence found in these regions could provide insight into periods when the Arctic may have been far warmer than it is today. At the same time, the sheer difficulty of navigating the region meant that large portions of the archipelago remained completely unexplored, leaving significant gaps in knowledge that fueled both scientific curiosity and speculation. These unknowns created an environment in which the Arctic was seen not just as a place to be mapped, but as a potential source of hidden knowledge about the planet's past, making it one of the most compelling frontiers of its time. As interest in the Arctic grew, so too did the number of expeditions attempting to reach it, each driven by a combination of national pride, scientific ambition, and personal determination, as explorers sought to push the boundaries of what was considered possible. The race to reach the North Pole became a defining goal of this era, attracting individuals who were willing to endure extreme conditions in pursuit of a singular achievement that would secure their place in history. However, the journey to the pole was not a straightforward path, and many expeditions found themselves diverted by the challenges of the environment, forced to adapt their objectives as they encountered shifting ice, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of isolation. In this context, Franz Josef Land emerged as a critical staging ground, offering a series of islands that could be used as bases for further exploration, even as they presented their own set of dangers. The combination of accessibility and mystery made the archipelago a focal point for exploration, drawing in teams from multiple countries who were eager to uncover its secrets. Yet, despite the increasing number of expeditions, the region remained largely unknown, with each journey adding only small pieces to a much larger puzzle that would take decades to assemble. Another factor that contributed to the growing fascination with the Arctic was the emergence of new scientific disciplines that sought to understand the Earth in more comprehensive ways, including geology, climatology, and oceanography, all of which could benefit from data collected in extreme environments. Researchers believed that the Arctic held valuable information about the planet's past, particularly in relation to climate change, as the layers of ice and rock found in these regions could serve as records of environmental conditions spanning thousands or even millions of years. This perspective shifted the focus of exploration from simple discovery to detailed observation, as expeditions began to prioritize the collection of samples and the documentation of geological features. In Franz Josef Land, the presence of volcanic rock and unusual formations made it an ideal location for such studies, even though the tools available at the time were limited in their ability to fully analyze what was found. As a result, many of the observations made during this period would only be fully understood years later, when advances in technology allowed scientists to revisit and reinterpret the data collected by early explorers. Despite the growing emphasis on science, the Arctic remained an inherently dangerous environment, where even well-planned expeditions could quickly unravel due to unforeseen circumstances. Ships became trapped in ice, supplies ran out, and communication with the outside world was often impossible, leaving explorers to rely on their own resourcefulness to survive. These challenges created a sense of unpredictability that added to the allure of the region, as each expedition carried with it the possibility of both groundbreaking discovery and catastrophic failure. In Franz Josef Land, the combination of isolation and harsh conditions made it particularly difficult to conduct sustained exploration, limiting the ability of researchers to fully investigate the islands and leaving many questions unanswered. This uncertainty, in turn, contributed to the perception that the Arctic was a place where important discoveries could be made, even if they were not immediately recognized or understood. At the same time, the cultural perception of the Arctic began to evolve, as stories of exploration captured the public imagination and transformed these distant regions into symbols of human ambition and perseverance. Newspapers and magazines reported on expeditions with a sense of drama, emphasizing the dangers faced by explorers and the potential significance of their discoveries, which helped to generate support for further exploration. This attention also attracted the interest of wealthy individuals who saw an opportunity to contribute to these efforts, either out of genuine curiosity or a desire for recognition, leading to an increase in privately funded expeditions that complemented those organized by governments. In this way, the Arctic became a shared project involving a wide range of participants, each bringing their own motivations and expectations to the endeavor. As the 20th century approached, it became clear that the Arctic was no longer an unknown void, but a complex and dynamic region that required careful study and exploration to fully understand. The discoveries made in Franz Josef Land and other parts of the Arctic had already begun to challenge existing assumptions about the Earth's climate and geological history, suggesting that the planet had undergone significant changes over time. However, these insights were still incomplete, and much of the region remained inaccessible, leaving open the possibility that further exploration could reveal even more surprising information. It was within this context of growing interest and limited knowledge that the events of 1903 and 1904 would unfold. As a new expedition set out to explore Franz Josef Land, and push further into the Arctic than ever before. The stage was set for one of the most difficult and revealing journeys in the history of Arctic exploration. A journey that would not only test the limits of human endurance, but also lead to discoveries that would quietly reshape our understanding of the region. What began as a carefully planned attempt to reach the North Pole would soon become something entirely different, as unforeseen circumstances forced the expedition to confront the realities of the Arctic in ways they had never anticipated. In the process, they would uncover evidence of a hidden past beneath the ice, evidence that would raise new questions about the history of the Earth and the forces that had shaped it over time. The men who funded the unknown. The early 20th century marked a shift in how exploration was financed, as the immense costs and risks associated with Arctic expeditions began to exceed what many governments were willing to support on their own, opening the door for private wealth to play a decisive role in shaping the direction of discovery. Wealthy industrialists and financiers saw these expeditions not only as scientific endeavors, but as opportunities to attach their names to historic achievements, creating a powerful incentive to fund increasingly ambitious journeys into some of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Among the most notable figures of this era was William Ziegler, an American baking powder magnate who dedicated a significant portion of his fortune to Arctic exploration, driven by the belief that reaching the North Pole would represent one of the greatest accomplishments of his time. His financial backing allowed for the organization of large-scale expeditions equipped with advanced supplies, specialized equipment, and carefully selected crews, all designed to maximize the chances of success in an environment where failure was often the norm rather than the exception. On the 23rd of June 1903, the ship America departed from Tromsø, Norway, under the leadership of Anthony Fiala, carrying the hopes of Ziegler and the expectations of the scientific community, as well as enough provisions to sustain the expedition for an extended period in the Arctic. The plan was methodical, involving the establishment of a base within Franz Josef Land, from which smaller teams would attempt to push further north toward the pole, using sleds and carefully rationed supplies to navigate the frozen terrain. This approach reflected the lessons learned from earlier expeditions, which had demonstrated the importance of preparation and adaptability in the face of unpredictable conditions. However, even the most carefully designed plans could not account for every variable in the Arctic, where shifting ice, sudden storms, and extreme cold could quickly disrupt even the best organized operations. While Ziegler's role as a primary financier is well documented, it is important to recognize that Arctic exploration during this period was part of a broader network of influence that extended across Europe and North America, where wealthy families and financial institutions often contributed to scientific efforts through indirect means. The Rothschild family, known for their extensive banking empire and involvement in various philanthropic and scientific initiatives, were part of this wider environment in which exploration was supported by private wealth. Although there is no direct evidence that the Rothschilds funded the specific expedition led by Fiala, their influence in supporting scientific research and exploration during this era reflects a pattern in which powerful financial networks helped make such journeys possible. This indirect involvement has contributed to later speculation, as the presence of influential names in the background of exploration has sometimes been interpreted as evidence of deeper or more secretive motivations. The relationship between funding and exploration also introduced complexities regarding how information was recorded and shared, as expeditions often depended on their sponsors for continued support, creating incentives to present findings in ways that aligned with expectations or interests. Reports from these journeys were sometimes incomplete, delayed, or filtered through multiple sources before reaching the public, leading to gaps in the historical record that can be difficult to fully reconstruct. In some cases, The harsh conditions of the Arctic itself contributed to this lack of clarity, as documents were lost, equipment was damaged, and communication with the outside world was limited or non-existent for long periods of time. These factors combined to create an environment in which not all discoveries were immediately understood or widely known, leaving room for later interpretation and speculation. Another important aspect of privately funded expeditions was the level of autonomy they allowed, as leaders like Fiala were often given significant freedom to make decisions in the field, adapting their strategies based on the conditions they encountered. This flexibility was essential in the Arctic, where rigid plans could quickly become obsolete, but it also meant that expeditions could diverge from their original objectives, exploring areas or phenomena that were not part of their initial mission. In the case of the America expedition, this autonomy would become particularly significant after the loss of the ship, when survival became the primary concern and exploration took on a different, more immediate purpose. At the same time, the involvement of private funding contributed to a broader sense of competition among expeditions, as different groups sought to achieve breakthroughs that would distinguish them from their rivals, whether by reaching new locations, making significant discoveries, or demonstrating innovative techniques for surviving in extreme conditions. This competitive atmosphere encouraged bold decisions and increased the willingness of explorers to take risks, sometimes pushing them beyond the limits of what was considered safe or practical. In the Arctic, where even minor miscalculations could have severe consequences, this drive for achievement often came at a high cost. By the time Fiala and his team entered the Arctic in 1903, they were part of a complex system shaped by ambition, wealth, and the pursuit of knowledge. A system that had made their expedition possible, but also placed immense pressure on them to succeed. What they could not have anticipated was how quickly their mission would shift from exploration to survival, forcing them to confront the Arctic in its most unforgiving form and leading them to discoveries that were as unexpected as they were significant. The island that trapped an expedition. When the America reached the icy waters surrounding Franz Josef Land in August 1903, the initial stages of the expedition unfolded largely according to plan, with Anthony Fiala and his team establishing a foothold at Cape Flora, a location that had served as a base for previous explorers and provided a relatively stable starting point for further movement into the archipelago. From there, the expedition advanced deeper into the region, eventually setting up operations on Jackson Island by August 29, carefully preparing for the long and unforgiving Arctic winter that was already beginning to tighten its grip on the landscape. The men understood that their survival would depend on the stability of their ship, which served not only as transportation but also as a vital source of shelter, supplies, and security in an environment where exposure could quickly become fatal. As the weeks passed and temperatures dropped, the ice surrounding the America began to thicken and shift, creating increasing pressure on the vessel and raising concerns among the crew about its ability to withstand the forces at work. By the 22nd of October, 1903, those concerns became reality when the ship broke free from its moorings and began to drift uncontrollably with the moving ice, placing the expedition in immediate danger as they struggled to regain control of their situation. Efforts were made to stabilize the ship and protect it from damage, but the unpredictable movement of the ice made it difficult to anticipate or respond effectively to the threats they faced, forcing the crew into a constant state of vigilance as they attempted to preserve their most critical asset. Over the following weeks, the situation deteriorated further as the pressure of the ice increased, gradually compromising the structural integrity of the America and making it clear that the vessel might not survive the winter. The crew worked tirelessly to reinforce the ship and salvage as much equipment as possible, aware that they might soon lose their primary means of survival and communication. By the 21st of December 1903, the damage had become irreversible and the ship was effectively destroyed, leaving the expedition stranded in one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth with no immediate prospect of rescue. On the 22nd of January 1904, the remains of the America finally disappeared beneath the ice, marking the complete loss of the expedition's vessel and forcing Fiala and his team to confront the reality of their situation. They were now entirely dependent on the resources they had managed to salvage, as well as their ability to adapt to the conditions around them in order to survive the months ahead. This transition from exploration to survival represented a fundamental shift in the nature of their mission, as the objectives that had once guided their journey were replaced by the immediate need to endure. In the aftermath of the ship's destruction, the crew began to reorganize their efforts, establishing temporary camps and utilizing whatever materials they had recovered to construct shelters that could protect them from the extreme cold and wind. Hunting became a critical activity, as they relied on seals, polar bears, and other available wildlife to supplement their dwindling supplies, demonstrating a level of resilience and resourcefulness that would prove essential in the months to come. At the same time, the loss of the ship forced them to explore their surroundings more thoroughly than originally planned, as they searched for resources that could help sustain them through the winter. This period of forced exploration led the expedition into areas of the islands that had not been previously studied in detail, providing them with opportunities to observe and document features that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. While their primary focus remained survival, the act of moving across the landscape and adapting to its challenges allowed them to gather information about the terrain, the distribution of resources, and the underlying geological structures of the region. These observations, though made under difficult circumstances, would later contribute to a broader understanding of Franz Josef Land and its significance. The destruction of the America was a turning point that transformed the expedition into something far different from what had been intended, forcing its members to engage with the Arctic environment on a deeper and more immediate level than they had anticipated. In doing so, they set the stage for discoveries that would emerge not from careful planning, but from necessity, as survival drove them to uncover aspects of the islands that had remained hidden beneath the ice. What they found beneath the ice. Stranded in the Arctic with limited supplies and no clear path to rescue, Fiala and his team were compelled to search their surroundings for anything that could improve their chances of survival, a process that gradually led them to uncover one of the most significant and unexpected discoveries of their expedition. As they moved across the islands, navigating the harsh terrain and enduring extreme conditions, they began to notice variations in the ground beneath the ice, areas where the surface appeared darker or where the snow cover was thinner, suggesting the presence of underlying materials that differed from the surrounding environment. These observations prompted further investigation, as the crew recognized that any anomaly in such a uniform landscape could hold potential value. During one of these explorations, members of the expedition discovered deposits of coal embedded within the frozen ground, a finding that was both surprising and critically important given their circumstances. Coal, a combustible material formed from ancient plant matter subjected to pressure over long periods of time, provided a reliable source of fuel that could be used for heating and cooking, significantly improving their ability to withstand the Arctic winter. The presence of coal in such a remote and inhospitable region raised immediate questions about how it had formed, as it indicated that the area must have once supported dense vegetation under conditions very different from those of the present day. The discovery of coal not only enhanced the expedition's chances of survival, but also offered valuable insight into the geological history of Franz Josef Land, suggesting that the islands were part of a much larger and more complex system shaped by ancient environmental changes. This realization aligned with emerging scientific theories that proposed significant fluctuations in the Earth's climate over geological timescales, including periods when regions now covered in ice may have experienced much warmer conditions. For the members of the expedition, this connection between their immediate needs and broader scientific questions added a layer of significance to their findings, even as they remained focused on the practical challenges of survival. As the crew continued to explore the area, they documented the locations and characteristics of the coal deposits, noting their distribution and accessibility, information that would later contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of the region's geology. These observations, though limited by the tools and conditions available at the time, provided evidence that Franz Josef Land contained resources and features that had not been fully recognized by earlier expeditions. The act of documenting these discoveries under such difficult circumstances reflects the dual nature of their situation, as they balance the demands of survival with the pursuit of knowledge. Beyond the coal itself, the expedition's exploration revealed additional geological features that hinted at the dynamic processes that had shaped the islands over time, including layered rock formations and evidence of volcanic activity that suggested a complex history involving both tectonic movement and environmental change. These findings reinforce the idea that the Arctic was not simply a static and frozen landscape, but a region with a rich and evolving history that could provide valuable insights into the Earth's past. The significance of these discoveries extended beyond the immediate context of the expedition, as they contributed to a growing body of knowledge about the Arctic and its role in understanding global climate patterns and geological processes. While the members of the expedition may not have fully grasped the long-term implications of their findings at the time, their observations would later be revisited and interpreted in light of new scientific developments, highlighting the importance of their work despite the challenges they faced. In the end, what they found beneath the ice was not a hidden structure or lost civilization, but something equally profound. A record of the Earth's history preserved in the form of geological materials that told a story of change, adaptation, and transformation over millions of years. This discovery, born out of necessity and survival, would become one of the most enduring legacies of the expedition, demonstrating that even in the most extreme environments, the pursuit of knowledge can lead to unexpected and meaningful insights. The geological mystery of Franz Josef Land, long before modern satellite imaging revealed the structure of the Arctic, the islands of Franz Josef Land had already begun to puzzle the few geologists who studied the reports brought back by early expeditions. The archipelago did not resemble a simple chain of frozen islands formed by ordinary sediment and erosion. Instead, much of the exposed rock appeared to be basalt, a dense volcanic material that forms when lava cools rapidly. To explorers in the early 20th century, this was deeply unusual because it suggested that these silent islands had once been part of a violent geological system shaped by eruptions and deep internal forces that had long since disappeared beneath the ice. Even among experienced scientists of the era, the existence of extensive volcanic formations in such a remote northern environment raised questions about how different the Arctic may once have been, not only in temperature but in the physical structure of the Earth itself. As the expedition members moved across the islands in 1904, they began noticing that certain cliffs displayed layers that looked as though they had been stacked over immense periods of time. Some sections revealed dark horizontal bands of hardened volcanic rock resting above lighter sedimentary layers, suggesting multiple periods of geological change rather than a single event. These formations implied that Franz Josef Land had experienced repeated transformations over millions of years, first as a warmer environment capable of supporting vegetation, then as a region altered by volcanic activity, and finally as the frozen wilderness seen by modern explorers. To men who had arrived expecting only snow and hardship, the islands seemed to contain a buried story written in stone, one that no one had yet fully deciphered. One of the most intriguing aspects of the archipelago was the way the ice itself behaved around certain areas. Several expedition notes from the period described places where the snow cover appeared thinner or where melting patterns seemed inconsistent with surrounding terrain. In an environment where temperatures remained brutally low for most of the year, such irregularities were difficult to ignore. Some later researchers suggested these variations could have been caused by differences in the rock beneath the surface, where darker stone absorbed more heat than surrounding ice. Others believed underground fractures or geothermal remnants from ancient volcanic systems may have subtly influenced the ice above. In 1904, the stranded men could not prove any of this, but they understood enough to know that parts of the islands did not behave like ordinary frozen ground. The coal discovered by the expedition only deepened the mystery. Coal can only form from abundant plant material, compressed over immense spans of time, meaning that the frozen islands of Franz Josef Land must once have supported forests or swamp-like ecosystems. That possibility contradicted the image of the Arctic as an eternally frozen world and forced scientists to consider that the region had once existed under radically different climatic conditions. For early 20th century researchers, this was not just an interesting detail, but a major clue that Earth's climate had changed dramatically in the distant past. Beneath the ice was not simply fuel for survival, but evidence that the Arctic had once been something almost unrecognizable compared to the landscape seen in 1904. Because of the harsh conditions, most of what the expedition observed could only be recorded in notebooks and rough sketches rather than studied in detail. They lacked the drilling equipment and analytical tools needed to understand the full extent of what lay below the surface. Much of what they saw remained speculative, interpreted through the limited geological knowledge of the time. This created a strange gap in the historical record. The men clearly sensed that Franz Josef Land was more complex than anyone had assumed, yet they could not fully explain why. Their observations would later gain importance as modern scientists confirmed that the islands were indeed part of a large igneous province formed by ancient volcanic activity during a much warmer period of Earth's history. Modern research has since shown that Franz Josef Land contains some of the northernmost exposed volcanic rock on the planet, preserved beneath glaciers that still cover much of the archipelago today. These findings support the idea that what the stranded explorers encountered in 1904 was not merely a survival story, but an accidental encounter with one of the Arctic's most scientifically important geological regions. What seemed mysterious at the time was, in reality, evidence of a world that had existed millions of years before human memory. The hidden truth beneath the island was not treasure or ruins, but a fragment of the planet's forgotten past, preserved in silence beneath the ice, where the Rothschild name entered the story. The connection between the Rothschild name and polar exploration did not begin in the Arctic itself, but in the broader world of scientific patronage that defined the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Across Europe, wealthy banking families often funded museums, natural history institutions, and exploratory ventures that governments considered too expensive or too uncertain to support alone. The Rothschild family had become known not only for their immense financial influence, but also for their involvement in science, zoology, and geographic discovery. Their name appeared on collections, expeditions, and occasionally on remote geographic landmarks named in honor of their contributions. Because of this, later generations looking back at Arctic exploration sometimes assumed the family had deeper ties to northern expeditions than the historical record clearly supports. One of the strongest reasons for this confusion comes from the existence of Rothschild Island, a remote island in Antarctica named by French explorer Jean-Baptiste Charcot during his expedition in 1908 to 1910. Charcot named it after Baron Edouard Alphonse James de Rothschild as a gesture of recognition for support connected to scientific efforts. Because this island carried the Rothschild name and was associated with polar exploration, some later writers mistakenly projected that association backward into Arctic history, blending separate stories into a single narrative. Over time, internet speculation blurred the distinction between the Antarctic island and the earlier Arctic expeditions, creating the impression that the Rothschild family possessed or controlled a hidden island in the far north. In reality, there is no verified evidence that the Rothschilds owned an Arctic island in 1904 or directly controlled the expedition that became stranded in Franz Josef Land. The historical record instead suggests a more indirect connection through the culture of elite sponsorship that surrounded exploration during that era. Wealthy families often influenced scientific priorities by deciding which institutions, researchers, or voyages received funding. Even without direct involvement, that kind of influence could shape where explorers went and what they studied. In a time when much of the Arctic remained uncharted, the ability to finance exploration gave private individuals an extraordinary degree of quiet power over what parts of the world were investigated. The lack of complete records from many expeditions only amplified the mystery. Some reports were never widely published. Others were summarized in newspapers with dramatic exaggeration, and personal journals were often lost or scattered after expeditions ended. When historical gaps like these appear around powerful names, speculation tends to fill the silence. For some, the idea that influential financiers had a hidden interest in the Arctic felt more believable than the far simpler explanation that the era was full of fragmented records and misunderstood details. The Rothschild name, because of its global reach, became an easy symbol onto which people projected larger theories about secrecy and hidden discoveries. Another reason the story persisted is that the Arctic itself encourages myth. It is remote, difficult to access, and physically capable of preserving evidence for decades beneath ice. In places like Franz Josef Land, entire camps, tools, and traces of earlier expeditions could vanish under snow and reappear years later. To later audiences, the idea that something significant might have been found and then concealed did not feel impossible. When a famous name like Rothschild was added to that environment, the story naturally became even more compelling, regardless of whether the evidence supported it. Yet the more closely historians examine the period, the clearer the pattern becomes. The real story is less about ownership and more about the role of wealth in exploration. The Arctic was not discovered by governments alone. It was often opened by the fortunes of industrialists and financiers who saw prestige in supporting the unknown. The Rothschilds were part of that larger world, even if their connection to the specific events of 1904 remains indirect. The mystery survives because the line between influence and control can become blurred when viewed through the lens of a century of speculation. What remains most fascinating is not whether the Rothschild family secretly possessed an Arctic island, but why their name became attached to the story at all. It reveals how easily historical ambiguity can evolve into legend when combined with isolation, missing records, and the enduring human belief that powerful people must know more than they reveal. In that sense, the Rothschild connection says as much about modern imagination as it does about Arctic history itself, the myths that grew from the ice. When explorers returned from the Arctic with incomplete stories, the unknown often became larger than the facts themselves. In the early 20th century, the public rarely saw detailed scientific reports. Most people learned about expeditions through newspapers that favored drama over precision, emphasizing hardship, mystery, and survival. A stranded expedition did not simply become a logistical disaster. It became a story of men disappearing into a frozen world and returning with fragments of something strange. That environment made the Arctic fertile ground for myths, especially when discoveries were real enough to sound extraordinary, but too poorly understood to explain clearly. The discovery of coal in a frozen island chain was one example. To scientists, it suggested ancient climate change. To the public, it sounded almost impossible. The idea that forests once existed in what had become one of the coldest regions on Earth seemed difficult to believe, and that gap between evidence and understanding created room for speculation. Some imagined hidden warm caverns beneath the ice. Others believed volcanic heat concealed underground chambers. A few went even further, proposing that the Arctic preserved traces of forgotten civilizations buried by a global catastrophe. Most of these ideas had no evidence behind them, but they grew because the underlying discovery was genuine enough to make the impossible feel plausible. By the 1920s and 1930s, fringe theories about polar regions had expanded far beyond what the original explorers had ever claimed. Writers began blending real geography with imagination, suggesting that hidden lands, unusual magnetic forces, or ancient structures might exist in places no ordinary person could verify. Franz Josef Land, because it was so remote and so rarely visited, became one of several locations pulled into these stories. The fact that early expedition records sometimes mentioned strange ice patterns, unusual rock formations, or unexplained terrain only added to the atmosphere. Ordinary geological features became transformed into signs of something far more mysterious. The involvement of wealthy patrons made these stories even more powerful. Whenever a famous family name appeared near exploration history, people assumed there must have been a hidden reason. Instead of seeing private funding as a common part of scientific exploration, some interpreted it as evidence of secret agendas. In later retellings, financial support became exaggerated into ownership, and influence became transformed into concealment. The farther people moved from the original events, the easier it became for rumor to replace documentation. By then, the Arctic was no longer just a place. It had become a canvas for suspicion. Part of what made these myths endure was the Arctic's ability to remain genuinely inaccessible. Unlike many other historical locations, the far north could not easily be revisited by ordinary researchers. Ice, weather, and political restrictions limited access, allowing stories to persist without easy verification. If someone claimed an island contained something hidden beneath the surface, disproving that claim was often difficult. The environment itself protected the mystery. In some cases, the ice literally concealed earlier camps and artifacts, giving the impression that the land was capable of swallowing history whole. At the same time, the real science remained remarkable enough on its own. The Arctic truly did preserve evidence of ancient forests, extinct ecosystems, and massive geological shifts. It really did challenge assumptions about Earth's history. The difference was that the truth was slower and more complicated than the myths. Scientific explanations rarely spread as quickly as sensational stories, especially when those stories involved hidden knowledge and powerful names. As a result, fiction often traveled farther than fact. Even now, the myths surrounding Arctic exploration continue because they speak to something deeper than history. They reflect a persistent human belief that remote places must contain hidden truths. In the case of Franz Josef Land, the real discoveries were significant enough to inspire wonder without any need for invention. Yet for many people, the unknown itself became more compelling than the documented record. And once that happens, the ice begins preserving stories as easily as it preserves the land beneath it.